My husband invited his work wife on our anniversary trip to Hawaii. When I objected, he accused me of being insecure and insisted that successful men were allowed to have close female friends. By the time we returned home, he was no longer defending their relationship. He was begging me not to sign the divorce papers. I was on my way to the airport when my husband Ethan texted me. "I have a surprise. I hope you'll like it." We had been planning the trip for months. Hawaii was supposed to be our anniversary getaway, a chance to reconnect after a stressful year and celebrate 7 years of marriage. I hurried through the crowd near the check-in counters, expecting flowers, an upgraded seat, or perhaps some small romantic gesture. Instead, I found Ethan standing beside Claire, his 26-year-old coworker, while she balanced 2 bright pink suitcases beside her. Ethan smiled as though he had done something thoughtful. "Surprise," I invited Claire. I stopped several feet away, certain I had misunderstood him. Claire was the woman Ethan called his work wife. She was also the person who texted him after midnight, sent him selfies, filled their conversations with heart emojis, and seemed to need his attention every time he and I had plans together. Ethan had dismissed every concern I raised about her. According to him, I simply did not understand modern corporate culture. Before I could say anything, he explained that Claire had never visited Hawaii and had recently gone through a painful breakup. He said he knew I would not mind because I was supposedly compassionate. Claire stepped forward and hugged me as if we were close friends. "You're so lucky to have such a thoughtful husband," she said. "He used your miles to book my ticket so I could afford the trip." That was how I learned that Ethan had taken miles from our shared travel account without asking me. He handed me our boarding passes as though the seating arrangement would make everything feel normal. Claire had the window seat, Ethan was in the middle, and I was on the aisle. When I asked why he had arranged it that way, he said Claire became anxious during flights and needed someone familiar beside her. Then he added, "You like sleeping on planes anyway." Claire giggled and thanked him. Ethan leaned close to me and lowered his voice. "Do not make this weird. It's just corporate culture. Everyone treats their work wife this way." We were already at the airport with our luggage checked and our departure approaching. Part of me wanted to turn around immediately, but I was stunned, embarrassed, and still trying to understand whether my husband had truly invited another woman on our anniversary trip without telling me. I boarded the plane because I needed time to think, and because some desperate part of me hoped he would recognize how inappropriate the situation was once we arrived. He did not. During the flight, Ethan and Claire talked over me, shared snacks, watched the same movie, and laughed at office jokes I did not understand. Whenever I tried to join the conversation, Claire gave me a polite smile before directing her attention back to my husband. By the time we landed, I already felt like the unwanted third person on my own trip. After checking in and leaving our luggage at the hotel, Ethan suggested that we have a late lunch at a beachfront restaurant. I had been looking forward to that meal because he had described it as our anniversary lunch. When we approached the hostess, she looked at Ethan's reservation and said, "Party of 3, correct? Your husband changed the reservation last month." My chest tightened. Claire's presence had not been a spontaneous act of kindness after a recent breakup. Ethan had planned for her to join us at least a month earlier. He had changed the restaurant reservation, arranged the flights, used our miles, and hidden all of it from me until I was standing inside the airport with almost no time to react. At lunch, Claire sat between us. She sampled food from Ethan's plate, leaned against him while laughing, and told long stories about their office adventures. Ethan watched her with the kind of attention he had stopped giving me. I barely touched my meal. When I tried to remind him that the trip was supposed to celebrate our marriage, he frowned as though I were being rude to our guest. On the way back through the hotel lobby, Ethan stopped at the spa desk. He told the receptionist that he wanted to confirm the next day's couples massage. For one hopeful second, I thought he meant the two of us. Then he pointed to Claire. "For me and her." I stared at him. He shrugged and said, "I hated massages." I reminded him that I had never said that. I had said we could not afford the expensive package when we were planning the trip. "Same difference," he replied. Claire stood beside him, pretending to study the spa brochure, but I saw the satisfied look on her face. I told the receptionist that the appointments should be separate rather than listed as a couple's massage. She gave me an uncomfortable smile and adjusted the booking. Claire's expression changed immediately. Ethan pulled me toward the elevators, gripping my arm hard enough to hurt. "You're embarrassing me with this middle school jealousy," he whispered. "Everyone is going to think you're crazy. Is that what you want?" I pulled my arm away and asked why the opinions of strangers mattered more than his wife's feelings. He sighed dramatically and told me that every successful man had a work wife. According to him, I should feel grateful that he was transparent because most men hid these relationships from their spouses. The word transparent almost made me laugh. There was nothing transparent about secretly changing reservations, using shared miles, or planning an entire three-person anniversary trip behind my back. The worst part came when we entered our room. There was one king-size bed and a small pull-out couch pushed into the corner. Ethan looked around and grinned. "This will be perfect for the three of us." Claire immediately volunteered to take the couch. She said she did not want to cause problems and that Ethan and I should have the bed because it was our anniversary. Her words sounded considerate, but she looked at Ethan as if they were sharing a private joke. I asked why she did not have her own room. Ethan said another room would have been wasteful and unnecessarily expensive. That answer did not fit with the expensive dinners, first-class travel arrangements, or spa treatments he seemed willing to buy for her. That night, I lay on one side of the king bed while Ethan gave me a quick kiss on the forehead and turned away. "See?" he said. "Everything is fine. You always make a huge deal out of nothing." I stayed awake for a long time, replaying everything that had happened since the airport. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me into an uneasy sleep. At around 2 in the morning, I woke to whispering and quiet laughter. I kept my eyes closed and listened. Ethan climbed out of bed and walked toward the couch. "Come on," he whispered to Claire. "The bed is huge. She won't even notice." Claire offered a weak protest that lasted only a few seconds before following him. I felt the mattress shift as she slipped under the covers on his side. Ethan pulled her against him. "She's out cold," he murmured. I lay completely still, barely breathing. Claire rested her head on his chest while his hands settled around her waist. Whether they intended to have sex almost stopped mattering. My husband had invited another woman into our anniversary bed while believing I was asleep beside them. Their behavior told me everything I needed to know about the respect they had for me and for my marriage. I listened to their breathing become slow and synchronized. For nearly an hour, I remained frozen, torn between screaming at them and getting myself somewhere safe. Eventually, I slipped out of bed, carried my phone into the bathroom, and locked the door. My hands shook so badly that I mistyped my password several times. I searched for the earliest flight home and booked it using Ethan's credit card. The ticket was expensive, but I no longer cared. I packed quietly in the dark. Before leaving, I took several photographs of Ethan and Claire tangled together in the bed. I made sure the original files were saved to cloud storage, so the timestamps and metadata could not disappear if my phone was lost or damaged. Then I ordered a ride to the airport. The trip cost nearly $200. It was still worth every cent because each mile placed between that hotel and me made it easier to breathe. I blocked Ethan's number before takeoff. When I landed, I briefly unblocked it to collect the missed calls, voicemails, and messages, then saved screenshots before blocking him again. His messages shifted quickly from confusion to irritation. First, he asked where I was. Then he accused me of overreacting. Finally, he begged me to call him before I did something I would regret. For the first time in years, I recognized the pattern clearly. Ethan was not worried that he had destroyed our marriage. He was worried that I had stopped accepting his version of reality. I contacted a family attorney named Dana Mercer as soon as I returned. I showed her the photographs, our travel records, the spa confirmation, the restaurant reservation, and the messages Ethan had sent after I left. She did not promise me an easy victory or tell me that one photograph would decide everything. Instead, she explained what the evidence could establish, what records we still needed, and how I should protect myself while the divorce process began. We reviewed our bank accounts, property, credit cards, retirement funds, vehicles, and the house we owned together. Dana warned me not to destroy anything, publicly threaten Ethan, or empty our accounts. She advised me to preserve evidence, document every attempt at contact, and transfer only the portion of joint funds I was legally entitled to place in a separate account. Over the weekend, we prepared the initial divorce paperwork. While reviewing credit card statements, I discovered something larger than the betrayal in the hotel room. Several expenses from the trip had been charged to Ethan's corporate card and categorized as client entertainment. The beachfront dinner for 3, the spa booking, and Claire's travel upgrade all appeared to have been submitted as business expenses. There had been no client at any of those events. Dana explained that the company card issue was separate from the divorce. It was not something she could use as a threat to force Ethan into a settlement, but it was legitimate financial misconduct that could be reported through proper channels. I gathered the receipts and matched them to the dates and charges. I also located earlier statements showing that the Hawaii trip was not the first time Ethan had used company money on Claire. There were dinners, gifts, upgrades, and other personal expenses spread across several months. I created backups of everything and drafted a factual email to his company's human resources and compliance departments. I removed insults, speculation, and emotional accusations. The complaint focused on dates, amounts, descriptions, and supporting records. The following Monday, Ethan and Claire returned to work. Dana and I went to their office building with the divorce documents and the evidence packet. Their department was in the middle of a quarterly planning meeting when we arrived. I had not known the full executive team would be present, but once I saw Ethan through the conference room window, I decided I was done arranging my life around his comfort. His expression changed from confusion to panic when I entered. I walked to his seat and placed the divorce papers in front of him. "I wanted to make sure you received these," I said, "since you were too busy during our anniversary trip to notice that I left." The room went silent. Ethan's supervisor, Marcus Reed, started to speak, but I told him I had also submitted a formal compliance report. I opened my laptop and confirmed that the email, receipts, screenshots, and original records had been sent to HR and finance. I explained that Ethan had charged personal travel and entertainment involving Claire to the company card, while labeling the expenses as business-related. Marcus looked directly at Ethan and asked whether corporate funds had been used for an anniversary vacation. "Not exactly," I said. I placed one of the photographs from the hotel on the conference table. The company funds were used for Claire's part of the trip. My anniversary vacation apparently included the three of us sharing one bed. Claire immediately cried out that the picture was misleading. She insisted that nothing sexual had happened and that all three of us had been in the same room. Marcus stood so quickly that his chair rolled backward and struck the wall. He told everyone except Ethan, Claire, HR, and compliance to leave. Employees gathered their laptops and folders without meeting my eyes. Several glanced at the photograph as they walked out. Once the room was clear, Marcus told Ethan and Claire to sit down. A human resources representative returned with a notebook. Ethan dropped into his chair and covered his face. Claire remained standing, crying and repeating that the situation was innocent. She said I had twisted an unusual sleeping arrangement into something dirty because I was jealous. Ethan would not look at her. His face moved through shock, anger, and fear, as he realized that denial would not make the receipts disappear. The HR representative asked whether I had preserved original copies of the documents and photographs. I said yes, and explained that the email included timestamps, statements, reservation records, and cloud-backed files. Marcus told me the company would review the complaint and contact me if investigators needed additional information. I collected my laptop and walked out without arguing about what punishment Ethan or Claire deserved. The company had the records, my attorney had the records. I no longer needed to convince the room through emotion. Ethan followed me into the hallway. He tried to reach for my arm, but I stepped away before he could touch me. Then he used the calm, patronizing voice he always adopted when he wanted me to question my own reaction. He said we needed to behave like adults, discuss our marriage privately, and stop creating scenes at his workplace. I reminded him that I had tried to discuss his relationship with Claire privately for months. Each time, he had called me insecure, jealous, or old-fashioned. He had then secretly invited her on our anniversary trip, used shared and corporate resources for her expenses, and brought her into our bed while he believed I was asleep. "Everything goes through my attorney now," I said. "There is nothing left for us to discuss privately." He began another explanation, but I walked toward the elevator while he was still speaking. My hands trembled, so I pushed them into my pockets. My legs remained steady. When the elevator doors closed, Ethan was still standing in the hallway, staring at me as though he could not understand why his usual tactics had stopped working. I drove directly to Dana's office and described everything that had happened. She listened, took notes, and asked whether I still possessed the original files. I showed her the cloud backups and the folder on my phone. She then gave me a list of immediate practical steps. I needed a separate bank account, new passwords for every financial and personal service, and a complete inventory of our marital assets and debts. I needed to change the recovery information on my email and social media accounts so Ethan could not reset my passwords. I also needed a detailed contact log recording every call, text, voicemail, visit, and indirect message, including the date, time, and content. Dana emailed me a spreadsheet template before I left her office. Later that afternoon, an email arrived from Colin Hayes in Ethan's Human Resources Department. The subject line read, "Complaint Acknowledgement and Investigation Notice." The language was careful and formal. Colin confirmed that the company had received my report and was opening an internal review into the corporate card charges and workplace conduct. He did not promise that anyone would be fired, and he did not give me a specific timeline. He simply explained that HR, finance, and compliance would evaluate the records and contact me for additional information. The message made the situation feel real, in a way the confrontation had not. The issue was no longer only my word against Ethan's. A documented institutional process had begun. I forwarded the email to Dana and drove to the home of the friend who had allowed me to stay with her. She was still at work, so I sat at her kitchen table and logged into every joint financial account Ethan and I shared. Seeing the numbers made my stomach drop. 7 years of marriage had tied our lives together through checking accounts, savings, credit cards, retirement plans, insurance policies, a mortgage, 2 cars, household bills, and savings bonds his parents had given us as wedding gifts. I listed every account and automatic payment. I reviewed 6 months of transactions line by line, marking which charges belonged to me, which were Ethan's, and which were ordinary household expenses. I added the estimated value of the house and vehicles, our retirement balances, and every outstanding debt. The process took hours, and by the end my back ached from leaning over the laptop. Still, the spreadsheet transformed an overwhelming mess into information I could understand. Dana had told me that protecting my interests required knowing the complete financial picture, not simply reacting to whichever alarming transaction appeared next. I barely slept that night. Whenever I closed my eyes, I saw Ethan's hand around Claire's waist, or his face, when I placed the photograph on the conference table. At around 3 in the morning, I stopped trying to force myself to sleep and began making a list on my phone. I needed housing I could afford on my own income. I needed separate health and car insurance, updated beneficiaries, new emergency contacts, and eventually a new mailing address. I needed to protect my performance at work even though my private life was falling apart. I also needed a support system that did not depend on mutual friends who might treat the situation as gossip. The list filled several screens, but writing it down reduced the panic. Fear became a series of concrete steps. The next morning, Colin asked me to attend a formal interview and bring any records supporting my claims. We scheduled it for Thursday afternoon, giving me 2 days to prepare. I created a chronological timeline beginning with Ethan's changes to the restaurant reservation and continuing through the flights, spa booking, company card charges, hotel photographs, and messages after I left. I included the beachfront dinner receipt for 3 people, the couple's massage confirmation listing Ethan and Claire, and the airline receipt showing the upgrade charged to the corporate account. I added screenshots of messages between them containing hearts, private jokes, and references that made their intimacy impossible to dismiss as ordinary workplace cooperation. The goal was not to prove every detail of their personal relationship. The goal was to show that Ethan had used company resources for personal expenses and that both of them understood the nature of the trip. On Wednesday night, Ethan began texting from a number I did not recognize. The messages arrived one after another and swung between accusation and apology. He said I had humiliated him in front of senior leadership and destroyed his professional reputation over a misunderstanding. He said Claire was only a friend and that I had always been jealous of women who worked with him. A few messages later, he claimed he was sorry, had never meant to hurt me, and wanted one chance to explain. Then he returned to calling me irrational and vindictive. I took screenshots of every message, added them to the contact log, and forwarded them to Dana without replying. She reminded me that responding would give him another opportunity to manipulate the conversation or provoke a statement he could use later. I blocked the new number and activated Do Not Disturb. The following morning, the company's finance department contacted me directly and requested the supporting receipts. I attached the restaurant bill, spa confirmation, travel records, and the relevant corporate card statements. For each item, I provided the date, amount, and a brief factual explanation. The charges involved personal entertainment for Ethan and Claire during what had been presented to me as my anniversary trip. Finance departments tend to pay attention when someone labels a romantic dinner or spa treatment as client entertainment, and I felt a small sense of relief when the upload confirmation appeared. By Thursday afternoon, mutual friends had begun contacting me. Some wanted details. Others had already heard Ethan's version and believed I was attempting to ruin his career because he had a female friend. Several said successful men often formed close relationships with female coworkers, and that I should have handled the problem privately. One person told me that displaying the photograph at his workplace was cruel, no matter what had happened in Hawaii. Reading the messages made my chest tighten. None of those people had been in the hotel room. None had heard Ethan invite Claire into our bed while he believed I was asleep. None had spent the flight home alone, wondering how long the deception had been happening. I turned off my notifications and stopped explaining myself. People who wanted to believe that Ethan was the victim would continue believing it regardless of how carefully I described the facts. My energy needed to go toward the legal process, the investigation, and rebuilding my life. On Friday morning, I searched for therapists who specialized in betrayal, trauma, and divorce. I found Dr. Leah Morgan, whose profile focused on helping clients recover from relationship manipulation and major life changes. Her first available appointment was the following Tuesday at 2 in the afternoon. I booked it, added it to my calendar, and set several reminders because stress had made it difficult to remember basic tasks. That afternoon, Dana asked me to review documents requesting temporary court orders. She wanted the marital accounts protected so neither Ethan nor I could drain or conceal funds while the divorce was pending. She also wanted direct communication restricted because Ethan had already tried contacting me repeatedly and had appeared near the place where I was staying. The proposed arrangement required communication to go through our attorneys, except where the court permitted otherwise. I signed the documents after Dana explained what they did and what they did not guarantee. She told me the court would review the request, rather than simply approving every demand because I was upset. That distinction mattered. I was not looking for fantasy justice. I wanted enforceable boundaries and a fair process. Back at my friend's house, I organized the evidence into separate folders for photographs, receipts, text messages, emails, corporate card statements, and court documents. I downloaded copies, preserved the originals, and sorted everything by date. Looking at the Hawaii photographs still made my hands shake, but I forced myself to continue. The documentation was not revenge. It was protection. By Sunday, I had a packet that allowed anyone to follow the sequence clearly. When Ethan changed the restaurant reservation, when Claire's travel was arranged, when the spa appointment was booked, when the expenses appeared on the company account, and when the hotel photographs were taken. A few evenings later, someone knocked at my friend's front door. Through the window, I saw Ethan standing on the porch and calling my name. He said lawyers were making everything worse and that reasonable adults should settle their problems face to face. I did not answer the door. Instead, I began recording from inside the house, capturing his presence, his repeated knocking, and the time displayed on my phone. He remained there for several minutes before leaving. I sent the video to Dana immediately. She added it to the contact log and told me not to engage if he returned. Late that night, after my friend went to sleep, I opened a blank document and wrote down everything that had happened. I described the airport, the changed reservation, the spa desk, the hotel bed, the flight home, and the conference room confrontation. At the bottom, I wrote a rule for myself in bold. I would not defend my choices to people who had not been there. I would present facts through the appropriate legal and professional channels and allow the records to speak. My formal HR interview took place in a windowless conference room at Ethan's office. Colin sat across from me with a compliance officer who typed notes into a laptop. They asked me to walk through the Hawaii trip from the beginning. I kept my answers specific even when my throat tightened. I explained when Ethan first began calling Claire his work wife, when I noticed the late-night messages, when I learned the restaurant reservation had been changed, and what he said while arranging the couple's massage. They reviewed every corporate charge and asked what description Ethan had entered for each expense. The interview lasted almost 2 hours. That afternoon, Colin asked me to upload the original photographs with full metadata and provide unedited statements showing the charges. I downloaded the files from cloud storage and used the secure portal he provided. Watching the upload bar reach 100% left me feeling exposed, but also relieved that the evidence was now preserved somewhere beyond my personal devices. The next morning, Dana called with an update from Ethan's attorney, Victor Lane. Victor had filed a motion claiming that I was causing reputational damage by taking private marital disputes into Ethan's workplace. Dana was already preparing a response. She explained that the company card transactions were not merely private relationship complaints. They involved documented financial and compliance concerns. Her response would keep the two issues separate. The divorce addressed the breakdown of our marriage, while the HR report addressed the misuse of corporate resources. She did not tell me the judge was guaranteed to agree with every argument. She told me that the evidence gave us a defensible position. During my first therapy session the following Tuesday, Dr. Morgan asked what had brought me there. I told her about Hawaii, the conference room, Ethan's messages, the financial uncertainty, and the constant fear that everyone viewed me as unstable. She listened without interrupting and taught me grounding techniques for moments when anxiety surged. She asked me to identify 5 things I could see, 4 things I could touch, and then continue through the senses until my attention returned to the present. We also discussed the way Ethan had gradually trained me to distrust my reactions. Whenever I noticed an inappropriate boundary, he called me jealous. Whenever I asked a reasonable question, he accused me of creating drama. Dr. Morgan said my distress was a normal response to a serious betrayal and that leaving the hotel had been a valid act of self-protection. I left feeling emotionally exhausted, but lighter than I had felt in weeks. While reviewing old messages for the legal file that evening, I found conversations in which Claire mocked me directly. She called me uptight and boring, joked that I did not understand modern workplace relationships, and told Ethan he deserved someone who appreciated him properly. Ethan had not defended me. He had responded with jokes and affectionate messages. I read the exchange twice to ensure I was not misinterpreting it, then forwarded the full thread to Dana and Colin with the original dates intact. Those messages did not prove every rumor people were spreading, but they showed that Claire understood my discomfort and treated it as entertainment. They also undermined Ethan's claim that she was an innocent coworker who had accidentally become involved in a marital misunderstanding. A few days later, Colin informed me that Claire had filed a countercomplaint. She claimed I had created a hostile workplace environment by exposing her relationship with Ethan in front of senior leadership. My stomach twisted when I heard it. Dana remained calm. She said Claire had the right to submit a complaint, and the company would evaluate it. But my report concerned specific financial records rather than generalized harassment. The strongest response was not outrage. It was documentation. Over the next week, Dana prepared written submissions that separated the personal betrayal from the policy violations. Every sentence focused on verifiable conduct, company charges, dates, and records, rather than speculation about whether Ethan and Claire considered themselves a couple. The temporary orders hearing took place the following Tuesday. I waited outside the courtroom for nearly 40 minutes, while other cases were called. When our turn came, Dana requested mutual restrictions on direct contact and temporary financial support. Victor argued that Ethan needed access to marital funds for his living expenses and legal fees, and accused me of using the proceedings to punish him. The judge listened to both sides and reviewed the filings. She entered mutual orders, limiting direct contact and requiring communication through counsel. She also set temporary spousal support at $800 a month. It was less than I had hoped for, but Dana explained that temporary support was not the final property settlement, and that the amount gave me some immediate breathing room. Leaving the courthouse, I felt no sudden sense of victory. I felt protected enough to begin making decisions. That afternoon, I met with a realtor and explained my budget based on my salary and temporary support. The apartments she showed me were much smaller than the house Ethan and I owned. The first was beyond my budget. The second was in an area where I did not feel safe returning home late. The third had stained carpet, a cramped kitchen, and no elevator, but the building was secure and the rent was manageable. I began adjusting my expectations. I did not need to recreate my old life immediately. I needed somewhere stable that Ethan could not enter whenever he wanted. 3 weeks after the conference room confrontation, Colin told me that Ethan had been placed on paid administrative leave while the investigation continued. The decision meant the company considered the allegations serious enough to remove him temporarily, but it did not mean he had been found guilty or terminated. Colin could not promise a final result or provide details about confidential interviews. I thanked him and tried to view the leave as progress rather than complete vindication. The following Monday, a carefully worded letter arrived from Victor's office. It expressed regret for any distress caused by Ethan's decisions and said mistakes in judgment had occurred during a difficult period. It did not admit wrongdoing, misuse of funds, or an inappropriate relationship. I forwarded it to Dana without responding. She confirmed that it was legal positioning, not a personal apology, and advised me to let the attorneys handle it. That Friday, my banking app alerted me to several large transfers from our joint savings account. Ethan had moved $12,000 the day before the temporary financial restrictions became effective. I took screenshots and called Dana. She prepared an emergency filing, seeking to protect the remaining funds and require an accounting of the transfer. Seeing the money disappear hurt almost as much as the hotel betrayal, because it showed that Ethan had been planning for his own protection while claiming he wanted reconciliation. He knew restrictions were coming and moved the funds just before they took effect. Dana cautioned me not to retaliate by moving additional money. Our position would be stronger if I continued following the process. That weekend, mutual acquaintances told me that people inside Ethan's office were calling me vindictive and describing the situation as a jealous wife trying to ruin an executive over a midlife crisis. I wanted to defend myself publicly. Instead, I followed Dana's advice and stayed silent. The investigators possessed the original records. Social media arguments would not improve the evidence and could complicate the case. During my second session with Dr. Morgan, I described the counter-complaint, court hearing, rumors, and missing money. She helped me recognize the moments when I spiraled into worst-case scenarios. She taught me to pause before reacting and ask what action was actually available to me in the present. I could not control gossip, but I could preserve records. I could not force the company to fire Ethan, but I could cooperate with the investigation. I could not rebuild 7 years of financial stability overnight, but I could choose affordable housing and create a realistic budget. The next morning, I submitted an application for the apartment with the stained carpet. I paid the deposit from my separate account and scheduled the move for 2 weeks later. Holding the keys felt painful and empowering at the same time. The apartment represented the end of the future I thought I shared with Ethan, but it was also the first place that belonged entirely to the life I was choosing. Shortly afterward, Colin sent me a preliminary compliance report. I opened the document with shaking hands and found that investigators had identified $8,342 in personal corporate card charges over 6 months. The list included dinners, upgrades, spa expenses, gifts, and other transactions classified as client entertainment, even though no client was involved. Colin explained that the company intended to require full reimbursement within 90 days and impose disciplinary action. Because it was being treated as a first documented offense, he could not promise termination. I felt disappointed. Part of me had imagined Ethan losing everything the moment the evidence was confirmed. Reality was slower and less dramatic. The company had policies, employment procedures, and proportional disciplinary standards. The findings still mattered. It confirmed that I had not invented the misuse, and that Ethan's conduct had created a genuine compliance problem. That same afternoon, Victor proposed mediation rather than a full trial. He argued that prolonged litigation would consume marital assets and could take more than a year. Dana asked what I wanted. I agreed to try mediation on strict conditions. Ethan and I would not communicate privately. All proposals would go through counsel or the mediator, and I could end a session if he used it to pressure me into reconciliation. Victor accepted. At the first session, Ethan looked tired and older than he had in Hawaii. He began with an apology that blamed work stress, professional pressure, and poor communication. He said he had made mistakes but never intended to hurt me. When I did not respond, he suggested couples therapy and said we might still save the marriage. I looked at the mediator and stated clearly that reconciliation was not an option. The issue was no longer a communication problem. I did not trust him, and I did not want to remain married to someone who had repeatedly dismissed my boundaries and then tried to make me doubt what I saw. The mediator redirected the conversation toward property division, but Ethan continued returning to his apology as though the right words should erase the facts. We made little progress that day. 2 days later, Colin informed me that Claire had been transferred to another department where she would no longer work directly with Ethan. The company had decided not to terminate her. I felt angry that she seemed to be escaping with minimal consequences while I was rebuilding my entire life. Dana reminded me that my legal objective was to protect myself and resolve the divorce, not control the punishment imposed on every other person. Around the same time, Ethan began posting vague statements online about being targeted, misunderstood, and abandoned during the most difficult period of his career. He did not name me, but mutual friends responded with messages of support. I removed several people who treated his posts as an invitation to discuss my private life. The friends who genuinely supported me did not require a social media campaign to decide whether my boundaries were valid. When it became time to collect my belongings from the house, I arranged for a friend to help and called the non-emergency police line to request a civil standby. The officer remained near the entrance while I moved through each room, photographing the items I took and leaving Ethan's belongings untouched. Needing an officer present in my own home felt humiliating, but it prevented another confrontation. Ethan did not appear, likely because his attorney had warned him to stay away. I loaded my clothes, documents, personal furniture, and a few sentimental items into my friend's truck. I did not take things simply because I was angry. Every item was listed and photographed, so neither side could later claim property had disappeared. The second mediation session focused on the house. Ethan insisted that he should keep it because he earned more and could afford the mortgage. I said he could keep it only if he bought out my share of the equity at a fair value. Otherwise, the house should be sold and the proceeds divided. He accused me of punishing him financially. We spent 3 hours circling the same arguments before the mediator ended the session and scheduled another meeting. I left exhausted and convinced Ethan planned to prolong the case until I accepted whatever he offered. A few days later, Dana asked me to come to her office for what she called a reality check conversation. She showed me estimates of what a trial might cost, what a judge was likely to award, and which parts of my preferred outcome were realistic. At first, I felt defensive because I wanted her to tell me we should fight for everything. Instead, she kept returning to numbers, evidence, probabilities, and the emotional cost of extended litigation. Compromise did not mean Ethan's behavior was acceptable. It meant choosing a resolution that protected my future, rather than spending years pursuing a perfect punishment the court might never provide. Alone in my apartment that evening, I opened old wedding photographs and images from the early years of our marriage. I remembered the person I believed Ethan was and the life I thought we were building. I transferred the photographs to an archive on an external drive and removed them from my phone. I was not erasing my history. I was moving it somewhere it would not confront me every time I searched for an ordinary picture. The next morning, the company issued its final disciplinary findings. Ethan had to repay the personal charges within 90 days, permanently lost his corporate card privileges, and received a formal written warning in his personnel record. Claire received counseling about professional boundaries, but no financial penalty or formal discipline comparable to Ethan's. I read the letter several times. It validated the complaint, but it did not deliver the dramatic justice I had imagined during the conference room confrontation. Ethan still had a job. Claire still had a job. The world had not reorganized itself around the pain they caused me. I filed the letter with the other divorce documents and returned my attention to the settlement. In therapy, Dr. Morgan asked what I still wanted from Ethan. I began listing consequences I believed he deserved. I wanted him publicly exposed, professionally ruined, rejected by friends, and forced to understand every part of the pain he had caused. She allowed me to speak before asking how much energy I was spending monitoring whether he had suffered enough. The question made me angry because I wanted justice to feel visible. She reminded me that Ethan's growth, regret, or punishment was no longer my responsibility. My healing could not depend on him becoming a better person or losing enough to satisfy me. Over the next few days, that idea began to settle. I did not need proof of his misery to confirm the value of my decision. A mutual friend named Rachel later texted me to say Ethan wanted to discuss the house directly because avoiding lawyers would save money. I recognized the attempt to work around the contact restrictions. I took a screenshot and forwarded it to Dana instead of replying. She handled it through Victor. Maintaining that boundary felt like a small but important victory. Soon afterward, the court scheduled a trial date 4 months away in case mediation failed. Seeing the date made me realize how badly I wanted the process finished. I called Dana and told her to continue negotiating. I needed a fair outcome, more than I needed a courtroom battle. That evening, I reviewed the spreadsheet where I had recorded every minor expense Ethan might owe me. I had spent hours tracking $15 for takeout, $23 for gas, and other small amounts that barely mattered compared with the house equity, retirement accounts, support, and legal fees. I deleted the petty entries and reorganized the document around decisions that would affect my future. Letting go of the scorekeeping felt like releasing weight. At the third mediation session, Dana and Victor negotiated for several hours while Ethan and I sat at opposite ends of the table. Victor proposed that Ethan pay 40% of my legal fees and buy out my share of jointly owned furniture at a documented fair value. Dana countered at 60%. They eventually settled on 50% of my legal fees. Ethan agreed to the furniture buyout if I provided records of the original purchases. These were not spectacular wins, but they were progress. 2 days later, I received a message through the company's HR system bearing Claire's name. The wording had clearly been reviewed by attorneys. She acknowledged her role in crossing workplace boundaries and expressed regret for the discomfort her actions had caused. She did not admit to an affair or accept personal responsibility for the collapse of my marriage. I clicked the formal acknowledgement button without writing a personal response. That carefully constructed message was probably the closest thing to an apology I would ever receive from her, and I no longer needed more. The following weekend, I completed the move into my apartment. My friend helped carry a couch up 3 flights of stairs, then left me alone among the boxes. As the room grew dark, I sat on the floor feeling both lonely and free. The apartment was smaller than the house. The kitchen had little counter space, and the carpet still needed professional cleaning. Yet every decision inside it belonged to me. I could arrange the furniture without considering Ethan's preferences. I could close the door knowing he did not have a key. The life was not the one I had planned, but it was mine. The fourth mediation session lasted more than 6 hours. We divided retirement accounts, established transfer procedures, and discussed spousal support. Victor pushed for the smallest amount and shortest duration possible. Dana argued that I needed enough time to stabilize after taking on a separate household. We settled on modest monthly support for 18 months. By late afternoon, the major issues were resolved. Ethan would keep the house and pay me a lump sum for my equity, based on the current appraisal. The amount was less than I had once hoped for, but more than I feared I might receive. It was enough to cover a year of basic apartment expenses while I rebuilt my savings. We divided debts, furniture, vehicles, and retirement funds. The final negotiations continued through email and marked up documents for another week. When Dana sent me the completed agreement, I read it 3 times. It was not perfect justice. It was a workable end. I signed my name. The court clerk later confirmed that the settlement documents had been received and would be reviewed by the judge. After the required waiting period and final signatures, the divorce could be completed without trial. I marked the date on my calendar. A few weeks later, an email from Ethan's company appeared in my inbox announcing updated corporate policies. Out of curiosity, I read it. The company had strengthened documentation rules for business expenses, prohibited charging personal travel for non-employees, and required employees to disclose romantic or close personal workplace relationships within a defined period. Expenses such as intimate dinners and couples spa treatments could no longer be classified casually as client entertainment. The policy did not mention Ethan, Claire, or me, but several examples clearly came from the investigation. I forwarded the email to Dana. She replied that institutional changes often mattered more than an individual punishment, even when the person who prompted them received no public credit. I saved the policy update and tried to appreciate the fact that future employees might be protected by rules created because I had refused to remain silent. A woman who had previously worked in Ethan's department later contacted me and said he had been reassigned. His new title sounded similar, but the position involved less client contact, almost no travel, and fewer opportunities for advancement. It was a quiet step down rather than a public firing. The outcome matched what Dana had predicted. Companies do not always terminate executives for a first documented policy violation, especially when money is repaid and disciplinary conditions are accepted. I thanked the woman for telling me and did not request additional gossip. A week later, another former colleague said Claire had left the company. No one seemed sure whether she resigned or was encouraged to leave after the policy changes. Months earlier, I would have searched for every detail. This time, I felt only a distant acknowledgement that she was facing her own consequences. Her departure belonged to a chapter I was already closing. By my 6th therapy session, Dr. Morgan and I were spending more time on practical plans than on the immediate shock of Hawaii. We built a realistic budget for rent, food, utilities, transportation, and emergency savings. We created routines that included morning movement, regular meals, and quiet activities before bed. We also reviewed my friendships. Some people had actively supported me. Some had remained respectfully neutral. Others had chosen Ethan's version or treated my life as entertainment. Seeing those categories written down helped me understand that I was not merely surviving damage. I was deliberately constructing a new life. I took a personal day from work and spent it separating the remaining financial accounts. I closed the joint checking account after the authorized division of funds and opened accounts in my own name. The joint savings account required additional coordination, which Dana and Victor handled. I applied for credit cards based on my own income and established a small emergency fund with automatic monthly transfers. Each step was ordinary, but together they gave me a sense of control I had not felt for years. My finances would no longer depend on whether Ethan behaved responsibly. That weekend, mutual friends invited me to a birthday gathering. I nearly accepted before noticing Ethan's name on the guest list, alongside several people who had dismissed my experience. I typed and deleted several responses before sending a polite message saying I already had plans. Then I made real plans with a coworker to try a new restaurant. Choosing my own comfort meant losing parts of my old social circle, and that still hurt. But maintaining appearances was no longer worth sacrificing my peace. A few days later, Victor sent Dana a long list of household items Ethan wanted, including a coffee maker, kitchen knives, and decorative frames worth very little. The level of detail made the request feel designed to irritate me and extend the conflict. I told Dana to agree to the items. Winning a dispute over a coffee maker would not improve my future. Learning which battles mattered became one of the most valuable parts of the process. I developed routines that had no connection to my marriage. I walked every morning, experimented with meals Ethan had never liked, and read books before bed instead of scrolling through arguments online. Some evenings, the silence in the apartment felt crushing. Dr. Morgan had taught me that discomfort did not automatically mean I had made the wrong decision. Sometimes it meant I was doing something difficult and necessary. I learned to sit with loneliness rather than returning to people who had harmed me simply to escape it. A few weeks into my new routine, my car began making a grinding sound. The mechanic told me it needed brake repairs and a transmission service costing almost $800. The bill disrupted my carefully planned budget. My first impulse was to call Ethan and insist he pay half because the mechanical problem had probably begun while we were still married. Instead, I reviewed my expenses, delayed a few non-essential purchases, and approved the repair using my own credit card. It was not glamorous independence. It was expensive and frustrating. Still, driving home in a safe car that I had repaired with my own plan made me feel capable. One sleepless night, I drafted a long email to Ethan. I wrote everything I had never been able to say. How his lies had affected me, how his manipulation had made me question myself, and how deeply it hurt to see him protect Claire while treating my pain as an inconvenience. The email grew into several pages. I read it repeatedly and left it unsent. At my next therapy appointment, Dr. Morgan helped me recognize that I had written it for myself, not for Ethan. Sending it would only create another opportunity for him to minimize, deny, or redirect the conversation. The act of writing had already served its purpose. I deleted the draft and emptied the trash before I could reconsider. 3 weeks later, a thick envelope arrived from the court. Inside was the final divorce decree. 7 years of marriage had been reduced to formal paragraphs about property, support, debts, and legal status. I sat at my small dining table and read each page even though I already knew the terms. Relief came first. I no longer had to wait for the next mediation session, court filing, or attempt at manipulation. Then grief followed. I was not grieving the man Ethan had revealed himself to be. I was grieving the marriage I believed we had and the future I once expected. I allowed myself to feel both emotions. When I finally placed the decree in my desk drawer, I felt proud that I had reached the end without allowing Ethan to convince me that my boundaries were unreasonable. That weekend, I archived the photographs, receipts, screenshots, and legal records on a password-protected external drive. I kept them for tax and legal purposes, then placed the drive at the back of my closet. The workplace gossip chat continued discussing Ethan and Claire as though they were characters in a television drama. I opened the latest messages, felt only exhaustion, and left the group without announcing my departure. I did not owe anyone another explanation. At my own job, I asked my manager for a more challenging assignment. She offered me a high-visibility client presentation involving research, strategic planning, and direct communication with senior leaders. The project frightened me, but I accepted. As I returned to my desk, I realized how long my identity had been reduced, first to Ethan's wife, and then to the woman he betrayed. Being trusted for my professional abilities reminded me that I was more than either role. A few days later, a handwritten note arrived at my office. Colin had signed it. He explained that confidentiality rules prevented him from publicly crediting me or discussing the investigation, but my complaint had contributed to meaningful changes in expense reporting and relationship disclosure policies. Other employees would benefit from stronger protections because I had documented what happened. I read the note twice and placed it in my desk drawer. That private acknowledgement felt more valuable than public revenge. 6 months after I entered Ethan's conference room with divorce papers and evidence, I sat in my apartment on a quiet Saturday morning. A small plant rested on the windowsill, and sunlight passed through its leaves, turning them bright green against the wall. The divorce had not produced perfect justice. Ethan's career had been damaged, but not destroyed. Claire had left the company, though I never learned the exact circumstances. Some friends had abandoned me, and rebuilding my finances was harder than I expected. Yet I had escaped with my judgment, dignity, and independence intact. I had learned to preserve evidence instead of arguing with manipulation, to set boundaries instead of begging for respect, and to focus on the life I could control, rather than the punishment other people deserved. For years, Ethan had taught me to question every uncomfortable instinct. Hawaii taught me to trust myself again. The real victory was not watching his life collapse. It was building a life in which his choices no longer had the power to collapse mine.